Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and the 6-part story that is Try is easily one of the best takes on Digimon I've ever experienced. The reasoning behind my perspective is how it succeeds in advancing the very concept of this particular franchise. Try isn't just the next adventure for the kids who went to summer camp once upon a time and ended up as Digidestined. It's really the next step of life, a next step that Season 2 sort of played around with in its own fun ways. But Try? They made a full meal out of this ordeal. And in doing so, our heroes are forced to really, truly face the burden of the bigger questions, and make a handful of nearly impossible choices before it's all said and done. At least until the next installment where it will actually be all said and done, presumably. But, even without Last Evolution acting as a possible sequel/conclusion to this premise, it's hard to say for sure since the production team is completely different. These films still handle themselves exceptionally well as a follow-up to the first digital adventure. It accomplishes this in a number of ways, but what Try really comes down to is highlighting how the human characters have, and continue to, grow into young adults taking on more responsibilities. This foundation ties into how the movies frame the real world and the digital one, but specifically how the cast's changing roles in either plane of reality necessarily changes their perceptions. Or, in one important instance, didn't. But, before we get into the human characters, there's a really neat thing Try does as it pertains to the main Digimon partners here that's worth digging into. So, Digimon and the digital world itself, as an escapist fantasy concept, is a seamless metaphor for childhood. This is made all the more evident by the fact that it's literally summer vacation when the kids initially enter the world, which is as escapist as it gets for a lot of children. And as such, they get to go on this big adventure where the permanence of death is a non-factor, so they are never really in that much danger. And when it's all said and done, they can leave that world behind and fully focus on theirs once again, only to, on occasion, come back and assist the next generation. Sans Kari and TK, of course, who just become part of that next generation. It's a pretty nice foundation to build atop of, and Try does well to utilize the defining elements of Season 1 as well as the evolving responsibilities aspect of Season 2 to tell its story. And adding to that, they make even better use of the at times divisive relationship between the two worlds that defined a lot of Tamers, alongside the existence of secretive agencies monitoring everything from the shadows. But the biggest takeaway from all of this is how the Digimon partners of Try exist in the present day in relation to their human allies. The Digimon themselves have always existed to be a child's plaything, right down to the show outright stating that adults shouldn't normally be able to enter the world. And because they are, by their very nature, programming and not organisms in the traditional sense, they can't grow up or change in the same way as Tai and the others can. Even when they sort of understand the gravity of their situation by way of the reboot, there's not much they can really do about it beyond being friendly and tossing out puns every other minute, which I adore. And this is because, simply put, all they really can be is exactly what they've always been. And because of their presence as metaphors for younger, simpler times that will forever stay young and simple, we get a few standout moments from the partner pairs. We observe characters like Joe struggling to fully recommit to a childhood responsibility he wishes to distance himself from, for the simplest of reasons. They did their job. They saved the world. It shouldn't be on him, or any of them, anymore. So the true conflict for Joe, and everyone else in various literal and figurative forms, is how to hold on to some aspects of youth while also being okay with letting go of others. And nowhere do we see that more emphasized than with Mako. But we'll talk plenty about her severely underrated character soon enough. Director Keitaro Motonaga and his team did a lot of thinking about how to express this cast of characters in both familiar and sensible ways. Their main challenge, beyond finding a way to put together this grand story coherently, was balancing what Try needed to say with what this meant for the personalities of these pre-established characters, and the Digimon partners serving as an even clearer stand-in for youth, childhood, and the escapism that's allowed to spring from both was an excellent way to write those characters in these films. And it really doesn't take much insight to see how intentionally jarring the gang's plight is juxtaposed against the stagnant nature of their partners. But very importantly, it doesn't make what their partners offer in friendship and emotional support any less valuable, as we see with Tentomon and Izzy, for example. These relationships, however different now, still very much have their place, and that's part of why Joe eventually returns for keeps. That solved a rather sizable chunk of the tri-puzzle for them, which now brings us to the ways and means the production team went about handling the human cast. Adding to the great character details here, Tri specifically matured them in ways that reflect how their personalities would develop in a more grounded setting than their childhood adventure provided. And then they took it one step further by focusing on how the character interactions and dynamics could evolve as well. Matt and Ty provide one of the best examples of this point, specifically with how they both connect to and butt heads with each other, which is why I'm talking about them together. Matt was always the more cautious of the pair, and didn't always take kindly to Ty's reckless abandon that Ty himself would simply call courage. But, as an older lad, he's been through the ringer. He doesn't need to be as protective of a younger brother that seems to have his head on straight, and he thinks he understands life in Digimon well enough to act decisively in the face of adversity. Conversely, growing up for Ty means understanding Matt's caution a lot more, because life is more complicated than ever before. The stakes are real now that the real world is the bigger focus, and there's no telling what kind of impact rashness could have on either world. So Matt and Ty essentially switch roles here, with Matt becoming aggressively authoritative while Ty goes through 5.5 movies trying to figure out what the right call is. All of Tri does well to highlight that anytime they can, especially during team meetings, and every now and then, Ty does have to acquiesce to Matt's demands, despite his hesitations, and the really neat thing here is that it's a dynamic that speaks for itself. We didn't need a page-long mental soliloquy about how Matt thinks he's becoming more like Ty, or an awkwardly placed statement on how Ty is becoming more socially conscious now. So, with the advantage of mostly avoiding blunt force writing, their relationship was both well realized and felt like a natural element of the story. However, what we see when we look at Izzy and Mimi is a simple yet effective sort of reverse of what we got with Matt and Ty. Izzy's always been the guy to use his smarts to figure things out. That's pretty much been his entire MO since the beginning. He even figured out a technical solution that allowed for Tentomon's first Digivolution. Older Izzy has even more agency here, because he no longer has to deal with the unknown variables of the digital world. In this world, his world, where his computing skills have netted him an entire office space, he should be that much better at figuring everything out and keeping everyone safe. But then he kind of keeps failing to find a proper solution to an infection he wasn't able to quarantine. So now, instead of his big brain and social awkwardness being used as a fun gimmick and a means of dispensing his unique brand of humor respectively, both are given palpable weight. His inability to properly connect with people at times causes him to lash out, doing some real harm to group morale in the process. And his need to fulfill this particular role is so tied to his sense of self-worth that he can't even sleep properly until a solution is found. Despite having long since resolved his hang-ups with being an adopted child, a hang-up he dealt with through alienation and honing his computing skills, a sizable part of him still believes he isn't much of anything if he can't do this. But while Tri seems to agree that there's always been more to Izzy than utility, as showcased by his sudden need to upgrade his wardrobe, and gee, what could have inspired that, Tri also isn't interested in adjusting him to the same degree as some of the others. Instead, the films allow him to do what he does best, but with the added support of friends. And, as a result, he's once more able to think through a solution, and in doing so, be at peace with the amazing young adult he turned himself into, an amazing he doesn't always himself see. We see a similar, albeit much more pronounced, sense of self-acceptance out of Mimi. For really the first time, her eccentricness is called to the carpet in a way that forces her to confront herself. Although this doesn't come off nearly as well as with Izzy, mainly because her self-acceptance works out to the benefit of those she's working with only by happenstance. So she never actually has to go so far as to consider the cost of her selfishness, despite the legitimate gripes of her classmates. And having Mako around means her aesthetic aspirations for the school festival don't run into any real hurdles either. So I wasn't too high on Mimi here as written, even though the idea was certainly there. Because even with a lion's share of focus and determination, it left me feeling like they maybe skipped a few pages somewhere in the resolution. Which naturally brings us to the other side of the determination coin in Joe Kido. His focus for most of the first two movies is anchored towards avoiding digital responsibilities for real-world ones, so much so that Gomamon is treated more like that awkward cousin you pretend to put up with, rather than the partner Joe fought with in countless battles. And I like that in his and almost everyone else's case, how they're operating and what they think and feel in the now is fairly internal. No one is forcing Tai to be more cognizant of the world around him, or telling Izzy he might not be good enough to fix things with his signature intelligence, and likewise, no one is hounding Joe about studying harder to overcome the fact that he was never the most inherently capable one. The real battles our heroes now face, except arguably Mimi, come from within. But with Joe eventually returning to the team for good, he manages to overcome the paralyzing fear that often keeps him from acting, and narratively, I think Determination seeks to convey that fear as not being able to focus on adulthood should he do the right thing by allowing himself to re-embrace his past. Now, of course, the takeaway here is that with balance, you can do both. And even when the partner thing does officially end, the memories won't leave you and all that good cathartic stuff. But Joe not knowing that initially and going so far in one direction is the best way I can think of to write a character like him, especially since he's even closer to the cusp of adulthood than everyone else. Now, TK I thought was another really neat addition to the story in the short but sweet bit of direct involvement he gets. Instead of some overarching character journey he really didn't need, we see him embodying a very specific idea that stems from the most prominent theme of Tri. So TK starts off Tri in a fairly mild-mannered way. He doesn't exactly stand out, which is a feature not a criticism, but he does showcase this breezy, no-worries sense of maturity, perhaps meant to say that after going through twice as many gauntlets as most Digidestined, he's found himself in a pretty good place as far as growing up goes. Hell, in a lot of ways he's more put together than Matt is, at least on the surface. But, as we know, throughout the films, an infection that starts with Meicoomon and spreads throughout the digital world becomes an increasingly sizable threat, and the gang does everything in their power to avoid their partners falling victim to said threat. But in confession, we see Patamon distorting and even physically hurting TK, and there can be no mistake. But here's what really grabbed me about that scenario. When TK's easy, breezy, Hakuna Matata modern day attitude is tested, he fails. In that moment, the responsible decision escapes him, despite being fully aware of it, and he reverts back to childhood, in a sense. A childhood where permanence didn't matter, and the consequences are a lot less unfair. There's this perfectly tragic innocence inside the scene where Patamon willingly embraces death, so to speak, and TK, for all of his surface-level maturity, still can't bring himself to let go, essentially embodying the exact opposite issue Joe faces in the first two films. And given the fact that TK had to deal with a somewhat similar situation when Angemon kind of but not really dies, I thought it was a nice touch to strap the weight of this idea on him, especially as the emotional catalyst towards the inevitable reboot of the entire digital world. It was a selfish and stupid move, but again, that's not really a criticism, and the movie makes sure to ask the hard question of what anyone else would have done had they been as scared and confused as he was. But for a kid like TK, whose junior high years are defined by not living with Matt anymore, among other things, the fear of real change equates to the fear of real consequences for Tai. So if only for that single plot point, TK's involvement left a major mark on Tri. So with the infection spreading and Meicoomon on a rampage, the bittersweet reboot happens in an effort to solve the central problem. As such, their Digimon partners return back to the digital world, with all but Meicoomon herself unable to recall their past memories. But when the gang returns to the digital world, they find that reforging those connections isn't terribly complicated, and this mostly falls in line with Digimon themselves being simple, childlike beings who you can easily win over by way of their stomach. For all except Yokomon/Biomon, which brings us to Sora. Now, while Sora's relationship being the only visibly fractured one may present something of a plot anomaly, I think the plot we do get throughout Lost more than makes up for it, especially as a means of centralizing the emotions of a movie that, alongside coexistence, makes it abundantly clear that the digital world is not the fun summer getaway the team once knew. In fact, it's actively rejecting the Digidestined, and in a way that nicely counters the idea the gang believes about returning to the status quo. And because Sora is defined by being caring and mediating to the point of not even considering herself, it stands to reason that a Mon with no memory of her might see her insistence on connection as unnerving at first. So instead of just being partners of Biyomon again, she kind of has to fight for it, in ways similar to what Mako is going through. And fittingly, we get one of many mega forms through her self-sacrifice. The self-care message they may have wanted to push with her gets a little murky because of that, but it's nothing too egregious. Because I think the bigger point with Sora is this. With the digital world, there was always a level of continual danger. It's how the original show starts, and try and make sure you didn't forget that. So even more than Cliff's vanishing, or Genai being a dark psychopath now, or even getting separated by Digimon attacks, the last of which isn't even new, I think Sora embodies the real digital disconnect, so to speak, because the one thing our heroes could count on was their partner bonds, and Sora not having that to start presents us with by far the harshest backlash of that expectation. And that's not even the most interesting part of Loss, but we'll get there. As the child of light dating back to, well, childhood, Kari always had the most unique relationship with the digital world of the original 8. She's not quite the digital god, but she did once free an enslaved group of Numemon while basking in an angelic light, and she's always been able to communicate the will of homeostasis, an unseen digiworld force that also plays a large role in Tri. So that description isn't too far off either. Although her role as the human embodiment of the forces of light and dark intertwined makes a bit more sense with her original last name Yagami, which translates to 8 gods. The fact that Kari has struggled to balance these competing forces in the past is used to great effect in Coexistence. When Tai dies, but not really, her innate darkness powers take over not just herself, but fuse a dark digivolved Ophanemon with Mekumon's megaform in Regelmon, forming the lost Evangelion angel in Ordinemon. A fitting and likely intentional reference, since Eva is one of the most ubiquitous things in anime. The fused Digimon in question are both fallen angels, whose names are religious references, and the possible end result of Ordinemon's power matches up pretty well enough. As the last chosen child, and in many ways the most powerful one, it's fitting that her big moment of despair creates the last and most powerful obstacle. All this off the back of a 4-way fight that seemed designed to be confusing, frustrating, and chaotic, leading Kari to give into those feelings when the inconceivable happens. And only through the interpretation of the vision she has in the final chapter, Future, can she use her connection to Gatomon to solve the seemingly unsolvable, even if it only temporarily fixed things before Tai's return and ultimate decision. Timely too, since Hackmon was literally about to reboot the entire digital age, the effects of which would be unfathomable. We'll definitely get back to that in part 2, because the conclusion of Tri is the perfect close to this narrative, one that stems from an understanding of their characters, as well as leaning into a few neat philosophical ideas with surprising effectiveness. And of course, we'll also talk all about the interesting ideas present within Mako and Mekumon, the pair of original Digidestined now working for the government, and how all 4 contribute to the themes and bigger, wider world mentality of Tri. And until then, thanks for watching.